Close your eyes. Imagine you are standing on the edge of a cliff somewhere on the northern coast of Scandinavia. It is night. The air is cold and clean and smells of salt and pine. Below you, dark water stretches to the horizon, perfectly still except for the light rain falling softly across its surface. In the distance, a long ship sits motionless in the fjord. Its carved dragon prow faces the open sea. A single lantern burns at the bow, amber and warm against the cold, dark water. Above it all, the northern lights drift slowly across a deep navy sky, green and violet and silver, reflected in the water below like a second sky beneath the world. This is where our story begins. Not in a castle, not in a palace, but here, on the edge of the known world, in the age of the Norse, in a time when the sea was both highway and mystery, and the men who sailed it were feared across the entirety of the known world. Tonight we are going to travel back over 1,000 years, to a time when the world was wilder and colder and stranger than anything we know today, to the age of the Vikings. And at the heart of that age, half legend, half history, entirely extraordinary, stands one name above all others: Ragnar Lothbrok. His story is one of the most remarkable in all of human history. Part of it is documented fact. Part of it lives in the old Norse sagas, the great oral stories passed from generation to generation around fires like the one you might imagine burning on that long ship in the fjord tonight. Where history ends and legend begins is not always clear, but perhaps that is fitting for a man like Ragnar. So settle in, let your breathing slow, let the weight of the day fall away from you. We have a long journey ahead, and all the time in the world to make it. To understand Ragnar Lothbrok, you must first understand the world he was born into. It is sometime around the late 8th century. The exact year is lost to history. Scandinavia, the lands we now call Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, is a place of extraordinary beauty and extraordinary hardship. The landscape is dominated by water. Fjords carved deep into the coastline like the fingers of some ancient giant pressing into the earth. Forests of pine and birch stretch inland for hundreds of miles. In winter, darkness comes early and stays long. Snow covers the ground for months at a time. The cold is not the mild cold of a temperate winter. It is deep and penetrating and absolute. And yet people have lived here for thousands of years. The Norse people, the ancestors of what we would later call the Vikings, had built a civilization uniquely adapted to this environment. They were farmers and fishermen and craftspeople. They kept cattle and sheep and pigs. They grew barley and rye in the brief warm summers. They preserved food carefully for the long winters, smoked fish, dried meat, pickled vegetables. Their homes were longhouses, long low buildings with thick turf roofs that kept the heat in and the cold out. A central fire ran the length of the building, its smoke drifting upward through a hole in the roof. Animals sometimes shared one end of the longhouse in winter, their body heat adding warmth to the space. It was not a comfortable life by modern standards, but it was a life deeply connected to the rhythms of the natural world. The Norse understood the stars and the tides and the seasons with an intimacy that most of us today have entirely lost. And they understood ships. The Norse relationship with the sea was unlike anything else in the medieval world. They had been building boats for thousands of years, and by the 8th century they had perfected a design so elegant and so effective that it would change the course of world history, the Viking longship. If you have ever seen an image of a Viking longship, you already understand something of its beauty. Long and narrow, with a shallow draft that allowed it to be sailed in open ocean and rowed up shallow rivers. Clinker built, its overlapping planks flexing slightly with the movement of the water rather than fighting against it. A single large sail of wool or linen striped in red and white or ochre and brown. These ships were fast, extraordinarily fast for their time. A Viking longship in good wind could cover 150 miles in a single day. That is a distance that would take a medieval army on foot nearly 2 weeks to march. And because of the shallow draft, these ships could go places no other vessel of the era could follow. Up rivers, onto beaches, into shallow coastal waters. The sea was not a barrier to the Norse, it was a road, and they had built the perfect vehicle to travel it. But in the late 8th century, most of the Norse were not yet using these ships for what history would remember them for. They were using them for trade, for fishing, for travel between the scattered communities of the Scandinavian coast. What changed everything, what transformed the Norse from traders and farmers into the raiders and explorers that history calls the Vikings, is still debated by historians today. Some point to population pressure. The Scandinavian peninsula had limited farmable land, and as populations grew, younger sons with no inheritance to claim looked outward for opportunity. Some point to political fragmentation. Scandinavia in this era was not a unified kingdom. It was a patchwork of small chiefdoms and petty kingdoms, constantly competing for resources and prestige. Some point simply to opportunity. The monasteries and trading ports of England, Ireland, and France were wealthy. They were not heavily defended, and they were reachable in a matter of days by longship from the Scandinavian coast. Whatever the cause, the change came suddenly and dramatically. In the year 793 AD, a date that historians mark as the beginning of the Viking Age, a fleet of longships appeared without warning off the coast of northeast England. They landed at the holy island of Lindisfarne, home to one of the most revered monasteries in all of Christendom. What happened next shocked the entire Christian world. The monastery was raided, its treasures taken, its monks killed or enslaved, its sacred books scattered or burned. The abbot Alcuin, writing from the court of Charlemagne in Francia, captured the horror of the Christian world when he wrote that such a thing had never been seen before in Britain, that a pagan people had come from the sea and devastated the house of God. The Viking Age had begun, and somewhere in Scandinavia, a boy who would one day become the most famous Viking who ever lived was growing up, learning to sail, learning to fight, learning the stories of the old gods. His name, as history and legend would record it, was Ragnar. Before we follow Ragnar further, we should spend a little time with the gods he worshipped. Because to understand a Viking, to truly understand what drove men like Ragnar to sail into the unknown, to fight without apparent fear, to embrace death as something not to be mourned but celebrated, you must understand the Norse religious world. The Norse believed in a universe of extraordinary complexity and poetry. At the center of everything stood Yggdrasil, the world tree, an immense ash tree whose roots and branches connected 9 different worlds. At its roots lay Hel, the realm of the dead. In its branches sat an eagle whose wing beats created the wind. A squirrel named Ratatoskr ran endlessly up and down the trunk, carrying messages and insults between the eagle above and a serpent below. It is a strange and vivid cosmology, and at the heart of it stood the gods, not the distant all-powerful deities of the Abrahamic religions, but gods who were powerful and yet fallible, gods who fought and feasted and loved and grieved, gods who could be tricked, gods who would ultimately die. Odin was the All-Father, the chief of the gods. He was not a comfortable deity, not a god of peace or mercy. He was a god of wisdom, war, death, and poetry. He had sacrificed one of his own eyes at the well of Mimir in exchange for wisdom. He had hung himself from Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, in order to discover the runes, the ancient alphabet that held magical power. He rode an 8-legged horse named Sleipnir. He was accompanied by 2 ravens, Hugin and Munin, Thought and Memory, who flew across the world each day and returned to whisper what they had seen into his ears. And he collected warriors. The Norse believed that warriors who died bravely in battle were chosen by the Valkyries, Odin's warrior maidens, and carried to Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, a vast golden hall where the chosen dead feasted and fought each day, their wounds healing each night, preparing for the final battle at the end of the world. This belief that a glorious death in battle led directly to paradise had a profound effect on how Viking warriors approached combat. Death in battle was not something to be feared, it was something to be sought. To die of old age in bed was called a straw death, a death without honor. Thor was perhaps the most beloved of the gods in the everyday Norse world, the god of thunder, of storms, of strength, a great red-bearded giant of a deity who carried the hammer Mjolnir and rode across the sky in a chariot pulled by 2 goats. He was not subtle or clever. He was powerful and protective and loyal, the god of the common people, of farmers and fishermen and warriors. Loki was the trickster, neither fully good nor fully evil, a shapeshifter, a schemer, a god of chaos and cleverness, who was at various times the companion of the gods and their greatest tormentor. His children included the great wolf Fenrir, the world serpent Jormungandr, and Hel herself, ruler of the dead. And underlying all of it was a profound sense of fate. The Norse called it weird, a concept of destiny woven by the Norns, 3 ancient women who sat at the base of Yggdrasil, spinning the threads of every life. What was fated could not be avoided. Even the gods could not escape their destiny. This too shaped the Viking warriors' approach to life and death. If your fate was already written, then fear was pointless. You could not die before your time, and you could not survive past it. So you might as well sail into the storm. You might as well charge the shield wall. You might as well go west into the unknown ocean and see what lay beyond the horizon. It was into this world of long ships and long houses, of Odin and Thor and the turning of fate, that Ragnar Lothbrok was born. Here is where we must be honest with ourselves about the nature of what we know. Ragnar Lothbrok exists in the historical record in fragments and shadows. There are references in contemporary sources, in the chronicles of Frankish monks, in Irish annals, in Anglo-Saxon records, to a great Viking chieftain or king whose raids terrorized the coasts of Europe in the 9th century. A man of extraordinary boldness and strategic genius. A man whose sons would go on to shape the history of half a continent. But the detailed story of his life, his childhood, his wives, his adventures, comes to us primarily through the Norse sagas. Stories written down in Iceland in the 13th century, roughly 400 years after the events they describe, passed through generations of oral tradition before they were ever committed to parchment. This does not make them worthless. Oral traditions can preserve genuine historical memory with surprising accuracy across centuries, but it does mean we must hold the details lightly, understanding that what we are hearing is as much legend as history, as much story as fact. With that understanding, let us begin. The sagas tell us that Ragnar was born into nobility. His father, according to some accounts, was a king, a petty king of the kind that Scandinavia had dozens of in this era. A man who ruled a small territory, commanded the loyalty of a band of warriors, and spent his time farming and raiding and competing for prestige with his neighbors. Ragnar grew up, as all Norse boys of his class did, learning the skills that would define his life. He learned to sail almost before he could walk. The Norse relationship with boats began in childhood, and by the time a boy reached his teenage years, he was expected to be a competent sailor in any conditions the North Sea might produce. He learned to fight, sword and shield and spear and axe. The Norse fighting style was direct and brutal. Shield walls and close combat, strength and aggression, the ability to take punishment and keep moving forward. There was artistry in it, but it was not a gentle art. He learned the old stories, the sagas of the gods, the tales of ancestral heroes, the genealogies that connected living men to legendary figures of the past. In a culture without widespread literacy, memory was everything. A man who could recite the lineage of his family back 10 generations and the deeds of his ancestors in detail was a man of standing and substance. And Ragnar, the sagas tell us, showed exceptional promise in all of these things from an early age. The sagas describe him as tall and powerfully built, with the kind of physical presence that commanded attention in any room. Blue-eyed, fair-haired in youth, the classic image of the Norse warrior that has persisted through centuries of storytelling and no small amount of romanticization. But it was not his physical presence that set him apart. It was his mind. Ragnar was, the sources suggest, a strategist, a man who thought before he acted, who saw patterns where others saw chaos, who understood that the boldest move was not always the most aggressive one, but sometimes the most unexpected one. These qualities would serve him extraordinarily well in the decades to come. But first, the sagas give us a story of a young man, a story of a serpent and a woman and the beginning of everything. Her name was Thora, the daughter of a powerful Norse earl named Haraldr, and her father, according to the saga, had a problem. He had given his daughter a small lindworm, a serpent, as a pet, and the serpent had grown, and continued growing until it had wrapped itself around the bower where Thora lived, a vast and terrible creature that no man had been able to approach without being killed. Her father, in desperation, made a proclamation. Any man who could kill the serpent and free his daughter would have her hand in marriage and a generous dowry. Many tried, none succeeded. Then Ragnar came. He was still a young man, a teenager by some accounts, and his solution to the problem of the serpent was characteristically inventive. He made himself a suit of unusual clothing, rough trousers and a cloak, boiled in tar and then rolled in sand until they were thick and stiff and strange. Armor of a kind not metal, but something the serpent's teeth and coils might struggle to grip or pierce. He walked into the serpent's territory. He fought the creature, and he killed it. The saga does not linger on the details of the fight itself. It is the outcome that matters. The serpent dead, Thora freed, and Ragnar still young, still at the beginning of his story, claiming his prize. He married Thora, and by all accounts of the sagas, it was a genuine love match, not merely a political arrangement, but a real partnership between two people who were well suited to each other. They had children together, sons who will grow up to carry their father's name into history. And then Thora died. The sagas say she died of illness, the precise nature unspecified, as was common in the medical understanding of the era. She was young, and her death left Ragnar changed. Grief is a universal human experience that crosses all cultures and all centuries. And the grief of Ragnar Lothbrok for his first wife is one of the most humanizing details in a story that can sometimes feel more myth than man. He withdrew from public life for a time. He stopped raiding. He stopped the political maneuvering that was the constant work of a Norse chieftain. He grieved. But grief, even profound grief, does not last forever. And Ragnar was still a young man with a long story ahead of him. The next chapter of that story would begin, as so many of the best chapters in history do, completely by accident. It was sometime in the early 9th century. Ragnar had returned to the world of the living. He was raiding again, sailing the coasts of Scandinavia and the waters beyond, building his reputation and his wealth. And one day, according to the saga, his men landed somewhere on the Norwegian coast and went inland foraging for supplies. They came back with something unexpected, a girl, young, perhaps 12 or 13 years old, found alone in a remote farmstead, living with an elderly couple who claimed she was their foster daughter. She was doing the most ordinary of tasks when they found her, baking bread. But there was nothing ordinary about her. Her name, they would learn, was Aslaug. And the story of who she truly was is one of the great romantic mysteries of the Viking Age. The elderly couple who raised her claimed she was simply an orphan they had taken in. But the saga tells a different story. Aslaug was, according to the Norse sources, the daughter of two of the most legendary figures in all of Norse mythology and heroic tradition. Her father was Sigurd, the great dragon slayer, the hero of the Volsung saga, the man who killed the dragon Fafnir and won the cursed treasure hoard of the Nibelungs. Her mother was the Valkyrie Brynhildr, the shield maiden who's been put into an enchanted sleep by Odin and woken by Sigurd alone. Both of her parents were dead by the time Aslaug was born, killed in the tragedy of betrayal and revenge that forms the heart of the Volsung saga. And the infant Aslaug had been hidden away by her grandfather, concealed inside a harp, according to the legend, and spirited away from danger. She had grown up in obscurity, hidden, unknown. When Ragnar's men brought word of the strange girl to their chief, Ragnar was intrigued. He sent them back with a message for her, a test of a kind. He asked her to come to him neither dressed nor undressed, neither eating nor not eating, neither alone nor in company. It sounds like an impossible riddle, but Aslaug solved it. She came to him wrapped in a fishing net, neither dressed nor undressed. She held a leek to her lips, neither eating nor not eating, and she brought a dog, neither alone nor in company. Ragnar, the saga tells us, was immediately captivated, not just by her beauty, though the sagas are generous in their description of that, but by her intelligence, by the quickness and creativity of a mind that could solve a riddle like that without hesitation. He wanted to marry her immediately. There were complications. Ragnar at this point had already remarried after Thora's death, a political marriage to a woman named Thora. Or possibly he had not yet remarried. The sagas are not always consistent on these details, and different versions of the story arrange events in slightly different orders. What all versions agree on is the outcome. Aslaug became Ragnar's wife, his great love, the woman who would stand at the center of his life from this point forward, and whose sons would carry the Viking Age into its most extraordinary chapter. She was, according to the saga, a Völva, a Norse seeress, a woman with the gift of prophecy, able to read the signs and patterns of fate that others could not perceive. This was a role of genuine power and respect in Norse society. A Völva was consulted before battles and before voyages. Her words carried weight that the words of ordinary people did not. Aslaug would prove in the years to come that her gift was real. She and Ragnar had sons together, many sons, and the names of those sons would echo through the history of three nations. Ivar, who would be called the Boneless, perhaps because of a condition that affected his legs, though historians debate what exactly that condition was, or perhaps because boneless referred to some quality of his fighting style, fluid and unpredictable as water. He would grow up to be the most feared strategist of his generation. Björn, who would be called Ironside, so called because in battle no blade seemed to find him, his skin seemingly as hard and impervious as iron itself. He would sail further than almost any Viking of his age. Hvitserk, Sigurd's snake in the eye, named for the unusual marking in his iris that the saga describes as a snake or a serpent circling the pupil. Ubba, sometimes called Ubbe, a warrior of enormous physical power whose name would become a byword for ferocity. These were Ragnar's sons, the instruments through which his legacy would be written on the map of Europe. But before we reach the sons, we must stay a little longer with the father, because Ragnar's greatest adventures were still ahead of him. By the 830s and 840s, Ragnar Lothbrok had become one of the most powerful Viking chieftains in Scandinavia. This is where history and legend begin to blur most significantly, and also where they most convincingly overlap. Because in the chronicles of 9th century Europe, written by monks and administrators who lived through the Viking Terror, there are references to a great Norse chieftain whose raids grew steadily more ambitious throughout this period. Whether every raid attributed to Ragnar in the sagas was truly his, or whether some belonged to other men whose deeds were attached to his growing legend, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that the pattern of raids described in both the historical sources and the Norse sagas is consistent with the career of a single extraordinary military mind operating over several decades. And what a pattern it was. The raids of the early Viking Age had begun with the hit-and-run attacks of the kind that had devastated Lindisfarne in 793. Quick strikes on undefended coastal targets, monasteries, small trading ports, isolated farmsteads. Take what you can carry and be back on the ship before any organized resistance can form. Ragnar changed the scale of everything. He was not interested in small raids. He was interested in campaigns. His first documented major raid on England, if we follow the saga account, came sometime in the 840s. He sailed up the River Thames with a fleet that was not a handful of ships, but dozens. He penetrated deep into the English interior, far further than any Viking force had gone before. The English kingdoms of this era were fragmented and often at war with each other. The once great power of Northumbria in the north had weakened. Mercia in the Midlands and Wessex in the south were the dominant powers, but neither had the military resources to respond quickly to a seaborne threat that could appear anywhere along hundreds of miles of coastline and river. Ragnar exploited this fragmentation brilliantly. He did not attack the strongest points, he attacked the weakest ones. He moved quickly, struck hard, and was gone before a coordinated response could be assembled. He used the rivers as highways, exactly as the Norse longship was designed to do, penetrating to the heart of territories that considered themselves protected by their distance from the sea. The chronicles record the shock and terror of populations who had no framework for understanding what was happening to them. In a world where war was something that happened between armies in the field, the arrival of armed men from the sea, men who seemed to come from nowhere, who followed no comprehensible rules of chivalry or mercy, who took everything of value and burned what they could not carry, was genuinely apocalyptic in its psychological impact. And then came Francia. The Frankish kingdom, the territory roughly corresponding to modern France and Western Germany, was at this time ruled by the successors of Charlemagne, the great emperor who had united much of Western Europe under a single crown. But Charlemagne's empire had fragmented after his death, divided among his grandsons in the Treaty of Verdun in 843. The result was a weakened, politically fractured kingdom with a long and vulnerable river network. Ragnar saw the opportunity immediately. In 845, and here we are on very firm historical ground, a Viking fleet sailed up the Seine River toward Paris. Paris in 845 was not the great city it would later become, but it was already a significant settlement built on an island in the river, the political and ecclesiastical heart of the West Frankish kingdom. The Frankish king was Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne, a man who was intelligent and politically capable, but who faced military challenges on multiple fronts simultaneously and could not always be where the threat was greatest. He attempted to stop the Vikings at a bend in the Seine where the river narrowed. He failed. The Viking fleet, commanded according to the sagas by Ragnar himself, defeated the Frankish force and continued upriver. They arrived at Paris on Easter Sunday, 845 AD. The symbolism was not accidental. Easter was the holiest day in the Christian calendar. The arrival of pagan raiders from the sea on that particular day was a statement, deliberate or coincidental, that nothing was sacred, that nowhere was safe. Paris was not fortified sufficiently to withstand a siege. Charles the Bald faced an impossible choice: fight and likely lose with all the destruction that would entail, or negotiate. He negotiated. He paid the Vikings to leave. 7,000 pounds of silver, an almost incomprehensible sum in the 9th century, enough silver to fill a longship's hold many times over. Ragnar took the money and sailed away. He had not conquered Paris. He had not killed its king or burned its cathedral, but he had done something in some ways more significant. He had demonstrated that the greatest kingdom in Western Europe could be made to pay. that the successors of Charlemagne, the self-styled heirs of Rome, could be reduced to purchasing their own safety from sea raiders. The news spread across Scandinavia like fire across dry grass. Paris had paid. Every ambitious young Norse chieftain with a long ship and a crew looked at his neighbors and then looked west toward Francia and thought the same thought. If Ragnar could do it, perhaps so could they. The raids that followed over the next decades were not smaller versions of what Ragnar had done. They were larger, more ambitious, more organized, because Ragnar had shown what was possible, and possibility once demonstrated cannot be undemonstrated. But Ragnar himself was not finished. His greatest and most fateful adventure still lay ahead, and it would take him not west but east and north, and ultimately to a fate that became one of the most famous deaths in all of Viking legend. He was going to England, and this time he was going to the wrong part of it entirely. By the time Ragnar made his final voyage to England, he was no longer a young man. The sagas are vague about his exact age at this point. But the career they describe, years of raiding, years of building and consolidating power, the raising of sons who were themselves now grown men with their own reputations, suggests a man in at least his 50s, perhaps older. A man who had lived several lifetimes' worth of adventure and danger and achievement. And yet, according to the saga, Ragnar was restless. His sons had grown mighty. Björn Ironside and Ivar the Boneless and the others were raiders and leaders in their own right, commanding their own fleets and their own men. The shadow of his son's growing reputation was perhaps a goad to a man like Ragnar. Or perhaps it was simply that he was a Viking. And Vikings sailed. He assembled a fleet, but according to the saga, a deliberately small one. Only 2 ships, a handful of men. His wife Aslaug, the seeress, begged him not to go. She had seen something in the patterns of fate that frightened her. She urged him to wait, to take a larger fleet, to go prepared for what lay ahead. Ragnar would not listen. Some versions of the saga suggest he went with such a small force deliberately, that he wanted to prove to his sons, to his men, to himself, that he could still do what he had always done. That age had not diminished him. Whatever the reason, he sailed. The voyage went badly from the start. Storms battered the fleet in the North Sea. By the time the 2 ships reached the English coast, the coast of Northumbria in the northeast of England, they were damaged and struggling. They were driven ashore. The king of Northumbria at this time was a man named Ella, a hard and ambitious man who had seized the Northumbrian throne through ruthlessness and cunning, and who had no intention of allowing a Viking raider, even the great Ragnar Lothbrok, to cause trouble in his kingdom. Ragnar and his men, stranded on the Northumbrian coast with damaged ships and depleted numbers, fought. The sagas describe him fighting with extraordinary courage, the old warrior refusing to yield, taking terrible wounds, continuing to advance when younger men might have broken. But 2 ships and a handful of men were not enough, not against the full military strength of a Northumbrian kingdom that had time to respond. Ragnar was captured. He sentenced Ragnar to death by snake pit, a pit full of venomous serpents, a death that was slow and agonizing and deliberately designed to strip a man of dignity. The sagas tell us that Ragnar died as he had lived, without fear, that as the snakes coiled around him, he laughed, that he composed verses in his final moments, Death songs, the Norse called them, celebrating his life and the deeds he had done, and the sons who would avenge him. The most famous line attributed to him in those final moments is this: how the little pigs would grunt if they knew what the old boar suffers, meaning his sons, the little pigs who would learn what had happened to their father. And then he was gone. Ragnar Lothbrok, king, raider, adventurer, husband, father, legend, died in a pit of serpents in the kingdom of Northumbria sometime in the mid-9th century. He was, by any measure, an extraordinary human being, a man who had taken the possibilities of his age and pushed them further than anyone before him, a man who had sailed to Paris and made an empire pay, a man whose sons would go on to shape the history of England and France and the Mediterranean world. But his death was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of its most consequential chapter, because the little pigs did indeed hear what had happened to the old boar, and they were not inclined to let it pass. The year is 865 AD. 20 years perhaps have passed since Ragnar's death in the snake pit of King Ella of Northumbria. His sons have grown into men of terrible capability. Ivar the Boneless, the strategist, Björn Ironside, the warrior, Hvitserk, Sigurd Snake in the Eye, Ubba. They have been raiding separately, building their own reputations, gathering their own wealth and followers. But now they have come together for a single purpose: revenge. What they assembled on the coast of Denmark and sailed across the North Sea to England was not a raiding party. It was not even a large raid. What they assembled was something the Anglo-Saxon chronicles would name with a phrase that still carries weight across 12 centuries. They called it the Great Heathen Army. And it was exactly that. Historians debate its exact size. Ancient sources are notoriously unreliable about numbers. But the most careful modern estimates suggest somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 warriors, perhaps more. A force of professional fighters, veterans of years of raiding across Europe, commanded by men who are not interested in taking silver and going home. They are interested in land. They landed in East Anglia in the autumn of 865. The East Anglian king, terrified, did the pragmatic thing. He provided them with horses and supplies and hoped they would go elsewhere. They went elsewhere, north to Northumbria, to the kingdom of Ella. They captured the city of York, the old Roman city of Eboracum, one of the most important settlements in northern England, in a surprise attack in November 866. The timing was deliberate. The Northumbrian kingdom was in the middle of a civil war, its two rival kings unable to stop quarreling even in the face of an existential threat. The following spring, the Northumbrians attempted to retake York. They failed. Both kings were killed in the battle, and Ella, the king who had thrown Ragnar Lothbrok into the snake pit, was captured. What happened next is one of the most debated events in Viking history. The Norse sagas describe a ritual execution called the Blood Eagle. In this ceremony, the ribs of the victim are cut from the spine, the lungs pulled out through the back and spread like wings. It is an almost unimaginably brutal act. Whether it was a genuine Viking practice or a later literary invention is still argued among historians. The sagas say that Ivar the Boneless performed the Blood Eagle on Ella, that he killed the king of Northumbria in the most extreme way imaginable as payment for what Ella had done to their father. Whether it happened exactly as described, we cannot know. What we know is that Ella died, that Northumbria fell under Viking control, that York, renamed Jorvik by the Norse, became the capital of a Viking kingdom that would endure for nearly a century, and that Ragnar Lothbrok, dying in a snake pit with laughter on his lips, had been avenged. But the great heathen army did not stop at Northumbria. It could not. It was too large, too hungry, too ambitious to simply settle in York and farm. It turned south. It moved through Mercia. It struck into East Anglia again. It captured Edmund, the East Anglian king, and killed him. He would later be venerated as a saint, Saint Edmund, martyred by the Vikings. And then it turned toward the most powerful kingdom left in England, Wessex, ruled by a young king who had not yet earned the epithet that history would give him, but who was about to begin the series of campaigns that would define his reign and ultimately determine the fate of England. His name was Alfred, and the collision between the great heathen army and Alfred of Wessex would be one of the defining events of English history. But that, perhaps, is a story for another night. As we move into the final passages of tonight's journey, let us pull back from the specific story of Ragnar and his sons and look at the larger picture. Because the Viking Age was not merely a period of raids and violence, it was one of the most consequential eras in the history of human exploration, trade, and cultural exchange. The Vikings did not just raid, they settled. In Ireland, they founded the city of Dublin, still one of the great cities of Europe, its name derived from the Norse Dyflin. In northern France, they settled so thoroughly that the region took their name, Normandy, the land of the Northmen. And the descendants of those Norse settlers would, in 1066, sail back across the Channel and conquer England in what history calls the Norman Conquest, an event that shaped the English language, English law, and English culture more profoundly than almost anything else in the nation's history. In Russia, they sailed down the great river systems to found trading cities. The very name Russia may derive from the Norse word for the Rus people who settled those river routes, though this etymology is still debated. They reached Iceland in the 9th century and settled it, building a society there that would develop one of the most sophisticated democratic institutions of the medieval world, the Althing, a parliamentary assembly that has been meeting continuously since 930 AD, making it the oldest parliament still in existence anywhere on Earth. From Iceland, they reached Greenland. Eric the Red, a Norse chieftain banished from Iceland for manslaughter, sailed west into unknown waters and found a vast ice-covered land. He named it Greenland, the sagas say, because a good name would attract settlers. And it did. And from Greenland, around the year 1000 AD, 5 centuries before Columbus, the Norse reached the coast of North America. His name was Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red. He sailed west from Greenland and landed somewhere on the northeastern coast of North America, Newfoundland most likely, based on the archaeological site at L'Anse aux Meadows, where the remains of a Norse settlement has been definitively identified. He called it Vinland. The Norse did not stay. The indigenous peoples of the continent were too numerous and too resistant, and the Norse settlements too small and too isolated to sustain themselves. But they had been there, 1,000 years ago. At the edge of the world as they knew it, in the ships their ancestors had perfected over centuries, driven by the same restless hunger for the horizon that had taken Ragnar Lothbrok to Paris and his sons to the heart of England. The Viking Age ended as all ages end gradually. The Norse kings converted to Christianity through the 10th and 11th centuries, and with Christianity came the written law, the organized church, the centralized kingdom that made the independent raiding of the earlier era increasingly impossible and increasingly unnecessary. The last great Viking raid on England is generally considered to be the Norwegian King Harald Hardrada's invasion in 1066, defeated by the English King Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, just weeks before Harold himself fell to the Norman descendants of Norse settlers at Hastings. By then, the world that Ragnar Lothbrok had known was gone. The longships still sailed, but as merchant vessels, as royal warships, as ferries between the islands of the North Atlantic, not as the terror weapons they had been in the age of the great heathen army. The gods of the Norse faded, Odin and Thor retreating into story and myth preserved in the sagas that Icelandic scholars would begin writing down in the 13th century, ensuring that they were not entirely lost. And Ragnar Lothbrok passed from history into legend, his name growing larger with each generation of retelling, his deeds accumulating the deeds of others, his story becoming the story of an age. It is late now. The story is nearly told. Somewhere in your imagination, perhaps, that Viking longship still sits in the fjord. The rain still falls, fine and quiet on the dark water. The northern lights still drift across the deep navy sky, their green and violet light reflected in the ripples spreading outward from each raindrop. The lantern at the prow still burns. It is easy from where we stand, from the distance of 12 centuries and the comfort of the present, to see the Viking Age as something remote and strange. A time of violence and gods and ships, utterly unlike our own world. But look a little closer. The people of the Norse world were not so different from us. They loved their children and grieved their dead. They told stories to make sense of a world that often made no sense. They pushed against the edges of the known world not because they were monsters, but because they were curious and hungry and alive. Ragnar Lothbrok, whatever the precise proportion of history to legend in his story, represents something real, a human impulse toward the horizon, a refusal to accept that the world ends at the edge of what is already known. His sons changed the map of Europe. Their descendants built cathedrals in Normandy and parliaments in Iceland and settlements on the coast of North America. The English language you are hearing right now contains hundreds of words that came directly from the Old Norse of the people who sailed those longships. Words like sky and window and knife and husband and happy. Sky. The Vikings gave us the word for the sky. Every time you look up at a clear blue sky or a night sky full of northern lights, you are using a word that came across the North Sea with the longships 1,000 years ago in the mouths of the people who built the world that Ragnar Lothbrok made. That is the legacy of the Viking Age, not just the raids and the battles, though those were real, not just the terror and the silver, though those were real too, but the words, the parliament, the cities, the routes across the Atlantic that would eventually lead, however indirectly, to the discovery of continents, and the stories, always the stories. Let the rain fall on the dark water of the fjord. Let the lights drift across the sky. Let the lantern burn at the prow of the old longship. And let yourself drift now, slowly and easily, down into the dark and comfortable waters of sleep. The story is told. Rest now.